Woodbury Getaway is the fifth installment in the Fears to Fathom horror anthology that is narrated by the ones who survives. In this story, we follow a few friends that plan a weekend getaway together, only for things to quickly take an eerie turn. So let's unravel this story and the ending's big twist. The story is told to us by Sydney Harper, a 23-year-old working at a big consulting firm in her city. Life with this job is stressful, consistently needing to juggle deadlines, client meetings, and just trying to prove her worth. The job paid well, but it was at the cost of her mental peace. Therefore, Sydney didn't have much time for a social life. She basically lived at work, jokingly mentioning how she should put a bed in her office because she feels like she lives there. She was practically a zombie. Sydney never had time to see her friends. Their lives would move on and she would just work. So her friend Mike suggests Sydney and their friend Nora rent a house somewhere in Vermont, a place where they can just chill, relax, watch movies, and eat junk food over the weekend. At first, Sydney was hesitant, but eventually she comes around. The plan was simple: rent a small cabin, close shift early on Friday, leave and be back for work on Monday. But of course, sometimes things do not go as planned. The game opens inside a consulting firm building that towers over the rest of the city. It's 8 o'clock at night, so Sydney is working overtime, and she's not the only one. She gets a call from Mike, who is calling to remind her to book the rental house for their trip. She's been super busy with work, but reassures him that she will book it. Mike then suggests that he picks her up since they're both in the city. They could save on gas and relive the good old days. A little bit of Mike and Sydney time. These two clearly have a history together, but we will talk about this later on. Mike mentions to keep the rental under $100 per night because their friend Nora has been on a tight budget, as things have not been going very well for her. So we go ahead and book a private cabin in Woodbury, Vermont. It includes Wi-Fi, TV, and even fishing. The perfect low-cost getaway for a few friends. It's now Friday, and Mike is on his way to pick Sydney up. Inside the elevator, we meet Gail, a software engineer playing a PSP, a device that was way ahead of its time. He mentions a snowstorm that is supposed to hit in the area soon, which will be important later. Mike pulls into the parking garage, and Sydney gives him a big hug. It's been a while since they've seen each other. Nevertheless, she throws her bags in the back and learns that Nora is going to be meeting them there, as the route through the city would have just been a detour for her anyways. So the two begin their trip. During the drive, it begins to snow, and together they take in the beautiful scenery. Driving through the snow felt like traveling through intergalactic space. The snow is like stars and galaxies rushing past them. Mike and Sydney start to reminisce on their time in college together, how they couldn't wait to get into the real world. But now, they would do anything to get away from it. Something I think most adults nowadays can relate to. Mike fills Sydney in on his new job, how he is working on a project that uses machine learning to predict market trends. So he spends all day coding. Following this, Sydney gets a text from Rick Wilson, the owner of the house that they are renting. We can see older messages of Rick introducing himself and giving her the code for the key to unlock the house. Suddenly, Mike almost hits a deer standing in the middle of the road. He mentions how in Native American lore, seeing a deer cross your path is like getting a message from the universe. Perhaps Mike is unknowingly hinting at what is to come. Sydney continues reading the text she got from Rick. It's past 5 p.m. and she has still yet to confirm her check-in. He mentions these roads can be dangerous, so it's important to let him know when you have arrived. It's interesting that Rick is making it a point to let him know when they're there. Keep this in mind. The snowstorm has slowed them down, but they should be there soon. The two decide to stop at Moe's Pizza and enjoy a few slices as they have worked up an appetite with all of this driving. So Operation Pizza Pit Stop is a go. Once they enter inside, we hear a weather report from the TV mentioning a strong snowstorm coming towards Woodbury. Residents are recommended to stay inside and stay warm. Of course, this was a nice little cameo from Queso. He and the other reporter go back and forth arguing. If you continue to watch the TV, you can see some pretty weird commercials, like one from Larry's Auto Insurance Animal Rescue Dealership. Buy a dog, buy a car, and then buy a car for that dog along with a purchase of some high-end insurance for the car you just bought for that same dog. Yeah. Anyways, Sydney and Mike order themselves a few slices. While waiting for the food, if we look back at some of the old texts from Sydney's friends, we learn from a voice message that Nora needs to put a new set of tires onto her car, but she can't because of her current financial situation, which is what played into Sydney renting such a cheap house. We also learn that Sydney hasn't seen Nora in over a year, how she kind of lost touch with her friends because of work. A voice message then comes in from Nora. She explains how something came up last minute and one of her clients needs her to make changes for a design she recently made. Nora has to do it because the payments from this client are the only things keeping her lights on. So Nora is going to be late to the house, but she has no choice. From here, Mike and Sydney eat their pizza together when a hitchhiker comes up to them and asks for a ride. At first, Sydney is open to it, but Mike ends up saying no, so the hitchhiker gets very upset and slightly threatens them, mentioning to be careful out there. This was odd, but regardless, they continued to their destination. They finally arrived to the rental. It was a nice little house in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing too out of the ordinary. After unlocking the door and entering inside, the two make themselves at home. It was relatively clean, warm, and cozy. The house had that rustic charm that you just don't see anymore. So Sydney and Mike decide to explore the house. When inside the basement, they find a locked door with a sign reading "No access to guests." Not something you want to see as a guest. Regardless, they continue and head upstairs. Sydney opens the first bedroom door, only to get surprised by who they think is Rick, the home's owner. He was a middle-aged man with a nervous energy. Rick welcomes the two and offers to show them around. This was odd and made them feel uncomfortable, but after all, he is the supposed owner. So Rick shows Sydney and Mike around the house. They ask about the locked door in the basement, but Rick assures them that it's just used for storage and that they should stay upstairs. Along the way up, Rick tells the two about how the old house owner's mother died in the basement, how some guests have been reported hearing voices at night and something moving around down there. But that was just a joke. Either way, it was a tactic to convince the two to stay out of the basement. From here, Rick decides to leave and mentions he's gotta find his cat. He also asks Sydney about the name on the booking, which is weird, but Rick just brushes it off to old age. After Rick leaves, Mike convinces Sydney to go fishing. They'll eat the carp fish that they catch. Mike knows a killer recipe, so they do just that. They catch fish and begin to cook. While they wait, the two decide to play a board game. Better yet, use an Ouija board. Mike suggests they use it downstairs to see if what Rick said about the death was real. With the lights turned off, they begin. A ghost actually responds to them when suddenly Mike hears something behind him and runs upstairs. The session was short-lived, but with everything that was going on, they were already on edge. Following this, Mike and Sydney eat dinner, and Mike plays a prank on Sydney by getting her to come upstairs and scaring her. However, Sydney does not find this funny. They decide to pass the time by playing hide and seek. After a few rounds, Sydney finds Mike hiding in the bedroom closet, but Mike could hear something coming from the attic above him and convinces Sydney to check it out. She finds a cat along with a few mattresses and some trash. This was odd, but Rick did mention looking for his cat, so Sydney brushes the discovery off as his cat probably just climbed up there somehow. The two play one last round of hide and seek. While Sydney is looking for Mike, she finds Rick looking under the bathroom sink with a hammer. He somehow got inside without them knowing. Rick explains he was just trying to fix the faucet, but Mike and Sydney threaten to call the cops, telling him he can't just walk in whenever he wants. Rick says that there are no cops around here and that they're not going to arrest the homeowner. So the feud ends and Rick leaves. Sydney and Mike both agree that something was off about Rick from the start. They felt as if he enjoyed making making excuses to come over unannounced. Regardless, they decided that Rick was weird but probably harmless. The two drove all the way out there, so they might as well enjoy themselves. It was getting late and Nora still had not arrived, but Sydney was getting tired, so she decided to get some rest. At around 11:30 at night, Mike knocks on her door. They sit on the bed together and we start to learn more about their history. During a trip together to Oregon, the two had a lot to drink one night and things happened, so they likely hooked up, and Mike suggests that those things could happen again. But they get interrupted by a voice message from Nora. She is about 70 miles away and one of her tires just blew out, meaning she is stranded on the highway alone and it's still snowing. So she asks if they can come get her. This was foreshadowed earlier from the other voice message about her tires needing to be changed. So Mike offers to go pick Nora up and let Sydney stay to rest. While sleeping, Sydney is woken up by someone at the front door. She was horrified to see that the hitchhiker from Moe's Pizza was standing at the door. He asks to be let in, but Sydney refuses. He gets upset, mentions karma, and leaves. While laying in bed again, Sydney hears a loud noise and screaming. It sounded as if someone was being attacked. In a panic, she texts Rick asking for him to come to the house since he lives so close. So Sydney heads downstairs and lets Rick inside. He somehow got there extremely fast and is still holding the hammer. Sydney explains the hitchhiker situation, and Rick tells her not to worry about him anymore. He also brings up the fact that Sydney is all alone, and this seems to calm him as he starts walking to the fireplace. Rick mentions how snowstorms like this bring out all kinds of folks like the hitchhiker, how not all of them know when to stay away. Sydney then gets a text from Rick. It reads, "Come back over. I live in Burlington. I haven't been to the rental in weeks." Meaning the man standing in front of her is not and never was Rick Wilson. Sydney puts the phone away and the man presses her about who she's texting. After trying to get him to leave, Sydney finally confronts him about who he is. The man yells how this is his house and he will leave when he wants to. He only wants the house and she is trespassing. Suddenly, the man goes and breaks the front door handle so no one can enter or leave. Sydney runs and hides in the basement. The man comes down and enters the locked room, meaning he has had a key this whole time. When running by, Sydney gets a glimpse as to what's in the room. It's a path to the outside, along with a mattress, clothes or sheets hanging, and some trash, almost like a living area. She runs upstairs and hides in the attic. The man looks for her, but Mike and Nora have come back. So the man runs off, and when the coast seems clear, Sydney goes back downstairs. The man escapes through the back door and Mike kicks open the front. Sydney explains everything that happened to Mike while he was gone, and Rick calls the police. The man was never to be seen again. The story ends with Sydney explaining her thoughts on the situation, how maybe the man was living in the house when it wasn't being used. The man might have been planning to rob the people staying there. However, the cops thought there was more intent behind the man's actions. Perhaps he also wanted to cause harm. Sydney also thinks that Rick might have played a bigger role in all of this, but he did give them a full refund. So what really happened, and what does this ending mean? The man Sydney and Mike found inside the house was never Rick, as Rick lived in a different town in Vermont, Burlington. Rick had not been to the rental house in weeks, so this man would likely sneak into the house using the basement doors from the outside to get inside. Him and his cat would stay in the basement room while no one was there, or maybe even while others were there, considering he mentions guests would say they heard moving around in the basement. He stresses that this is his house, so it's likely that he was the previous owner, and when explaining the mother's death to Sydney and Mike in the basement, it was probably his mother that died, assuming the story was real, even though he said it wasn't. But you could never trust someone like that. So he would sneak inside the house using the basement door and live inside the tiny room. That's why it was locked, so people wouldn't see that he's been living there. This is why he was able to show up so quickly when the hitchhiker came, and considering what he said to Sydney, he likely killed him. So was this man trying to rob Sydney and her friends? It's possible. Do I think Rick had something to do with it? Well, he wanted confirmation to know when they were there, perhaps to give this man a heads up. So maybe, but I guess we'll never know. What did you guys think of Woodbury Getaway? I'm actually from Vermont, so anytime it's included in media, it's so cool to see. Let me know your thoughts about this game in the comments below, and if you like horror game content like this, please consider subscribing. Also, if you want to support the channel more, you can become a member. Don't forget to follow my Twitter at TerrifyT. Thanks for watching.